One individual held the key to a future king's mind. This is the story of the royal tutor, a figure whose private lessons could redirect the fate of nations. You are about to enter the hidden world of these powerful instructors, where the ambitions of gilded age heiresses and the secrets of the schoolroom collided with the destiny of crowns. By the end, you will understand the astonishing personal forces that shaped modern monarchy. What happens when a mother's ambition for her son clashes with a tutor's radical ideals? How does a single educator quietly steer the course of history? What kind of person would you trust with the soul of a king? The royal tutor carried a burden unlike any other educator. Their classroom was not merely a room with books, but the entire world stage in waiting. This position demanded a profound fusion of roles, part scholar, part moral philosopher, and part subtle political strategist. Their true curriculum extended far beyond languages, history, and mathematics. It was the shaping of a human being who would one day bear the crushing weight of a crown, whose every word and action could sway alliances or provoke conflict. The tutor was entrusted with instilling the core values of duty, compassion, and judgment that would define a reign. They were building the very foundation of a future monarch's character, knowing that a single flaw in that foundation could one day crack under the pressure of leadership. This was an influence that rippled outward, not just for a lifetime, but for generations, quietly imprinting a tutor's own ideals onto the laws, traditions, and very soul of a nation. How do you even begin to teach a child about the solitude of power? How do you explain the delicate balance between royal privilege and profound public service? The tutor's success or failure was measured not in exam results, but in the peace and stability of an entire realm. This immense responsibility meant that choosing the right tutor was one of the most critical and perilous decisions a royal family could ever make. Across the Atlantic, a new kind of power was rising, one built not on ancient titles, but on staggering industrial wealth. The late 19th century saw a remarkable migration as a generation of American daughters, heirs to colossal fortunes from railroads, steel, and finance, set sail for Europe. They were the Gilded Age heiresses, and they arrived with a weapon their prospective aristocratic husbands desperately needed: cash. Their dowries were not just generous, they were transformative, capable of rescuing crumbling castles and funding the lavish lifestyles of dukes and princes who found their own ancestral lands could no longer support them. But these young women brought more than just money. They carried with them the confident, modern spirit of a new world, a direct challenge to the rigid, centuries-old traditions of the European courts. Imagine a ballroom where a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller entered, her gown perhaps a touch too lavish, her demeanor a shade too independent for the taste of a stuffy duchess. These women were not raised to be silent ornaments. They were raised to be forces of nature. Their very presence introduced a disruptive energy into the state halls of old world royalty, a whisper of democracy and ambition that would profoundly alter the families they married into. This was the social earthquake into which our royal tutor would step, tasked with educating a future king whose own mother might very well be one of these formidable American women. How would a tutor, steeped in classical European tradition, shape a prince who was, by blood and upbringing, a fusion of the old world and the new? For these American mothers, a ducal coronet was merely the first step. Their ultimate ambition was fixed on a far grander prize, a throne for their sons. They understood that a royal title, once acquired, was not the end of the game, but the beginning of a new, more complex one. Their strategy was generational. A marriage into a noble house was an investment, and the dividend would be paid when their own bloodline produced a king. This required meticulous, lifelong planning, and no part of that plan was more critical than the education of their princely boys. A son who was merely well-educated was not enough. He needed to be molded into the perfect candidate for a crown, a prince so capable, so charismatic, and so politically astute that he could not be overlooked when a succession was debated. The schoolroom, therefore, became a battleground for the future. These formidable women would involve themselves in every detail of their son's tutelage. They selected the tutors, approved the curriculum, and monitored progress with an intensity that could unnerve even the most seasoned courtiers. The tutor was not just an employee. He was the instrument of the mother's ambition, the craftsman hired to build her legacy. Every lesson in statecraft, every lecture on history, every nuance of diplomatic language was a brick being laid in the foundation of a future reign. Can you envision the pressure in that classroom? The young prince learning his Latin verbs, while his mother and his tutor silently calculated how each word might one day serve him in a speech from the throne. This was a quiet, relentless campaign waged with books and maps, a mother's grand design to see her child ascend to the highest seat of power, forever cementing her family's name in the annals of history. Long before a formal tutor ever crossed the threshold, the future king's education was already underway in the nursery. His mother, that gilded age heiress, was his first and most influential teacher. She was not a distant figure, appearing only for a daily kiss good night. She was a constant presence, a force of personality who shaped the very air he breathed. In those early formative years, she poured her own worldview into her son. She instilled in him a sense of immense possibility, the American conviction that one was not merely bound by tradition, but could actively shape one's own destiny. This was a radical notion for a child born into a lineage where his path seemed preordained by centuries of custom. Her stories would not just be European fairy tales of knights and castles, but likely tales of her own father's audacious rise, of building railroads or dominating industries through sheer will. Can you hear the difference in those bedtime stories? One speaks of inheriting a legacy, the other of building an empire from nothing. This created a unique duality in the young prince's mind. He was being prepared for a throne steeped in ancient ritual, yet his primary source of love and guidance came from a woman who embodied modernity, ambition, and a touch of disruptive New World energy. She was molding the foundational clay of his character, a substance far more complex than any European aristocrat might have expected. This was the raw material the royal tutor would later receive, a prince already imprinted with his mother's ambitions and her distinctly American sensibility. The tutor's great challenge would not be writing on a blank slate, but carefully sculpting a piece that was already vibrantly, and perhaps rebelliously, alive. The selection of a royal tutor was a political chess game played in the quietest corridors of power. This was never a simple matter of hiring the most brilliant scholar from Oxford or Cambridge. Every candidate was scrutinized not just for their knowledge, but for their family background, their religious affiliations, and their unspoken political leanings. The appointment of a single teacher was a public statement from the crown, a signal to the nation and to foreign courts about the future king's intended direction. Would his reign be one of progressive reform or a staunch upholding of tradition? The tutor's resume was their first clue. A tutor known for liberal economic views might prepare a prince to embrace social change, while a classicist deeply devoted to ancient history could steer him toward a more conservative, traditionalist path. The court factions watched this process with intense interest, each vying for an instructor who would subtly advance their own agenda for the next generation. Even the parents were often at odds. The father, perhaps a traditionalist duke, might favor a candidate who emphasized military history and stoic duty. The mother, our ambitious American heiress, would likely push for a more modern thinker, someone who understood global finance and the rising power of the press. She wanted a man who could teach her son to navigate a changing world, not just to preside over a fading one. The final choice was therefore a delicate compromise, a balance of old and new world values, all embodied in the person who would sit day after day with a young boy. This was the human fulcrum upon which a dynasty's future would pivot. What kind of man could possibly satisfy such competing demands, and what would it cost him to try? The classroom for a prince was a workshop for building a monarch. His studies went far beyond the standard lessons of a nobleman's son, targeting one objective: to forge a capable and resilient sovereign. History was not a dry list of dates, but a vital dissection of his own family's rise to power and the intricate missteps of rival dynasties. He learned the precise reasons a crown could be won, or just as easily lost. Fluency in multiple languages was a tactical necessity. French was the language of international diplomacy, German of key European alliances, and others depending on the empire's reach. This was not about reciting poetry, but about understanding an ambassador's subtle inflections or a treaty's dangerous loopholes without the unreliable filter of a translator. Constitutional law formed the bedrock of his future power, defining its exact limits and legal responsibilities. He was taught to navigate the delicate balance between his royal prerogatives and the growing authority of parliaments and ministers. Alongside this, military strategy was a constant study. Maps were not for geography alone, but for plotting hypothetical campaigns, understanding the logistics of supply lines, and grasping the grim realities of war and peace. The arts were equally critical. A patron's eye for painting and architecture bolstered the crown's prestige, while music and theater provided insight into the human spirit he was destined to govern. Every subject, from rhetoric to writing, was a single thread in the grand tapestry of kingship. The tutor's goal was to weave them all together, creating a ruler who could command a room, inspire an army, interpret a law, and sustain a nation's culture. This was an education in wisdom, not just knowledge, designed to prepare a boy for a solitude of power that few could ever comprehend. The most delicate lesson a tutor ever delivered was about the nature of the crown itself. He had to explain to a child that he was not just a boy who would one day become a king, but a vessel for a power that many still believed came directly from God. This was the ancient doctrine of the divine right of kings, a concept as heavy as any crown. The prince learned that his authority was not merely political, but sacred, a trust passed down through his bloodline by divine providence. This belief was the historical bedrock of his family's rule, a powerful narrative that had commanded obedience for centuries. Yet, the tutor's voice could not linger only in the past. Even as he explained this hallowed tradition, he had to ground the prince in the modern reality of constitutional democracy. The boy needed to understand that while his title might be inherited by divine right, his actual power was now circumscribed by parliaments, prime ministers, and the will of the people. How do you teach a prince that he is both God's anointed and a constitutional figurehead? The tutor had to walk a razor's edge, fostering a deep respect for tradition without creating a ruler who would cling to obsolete absolutism and provoke a revolution. The true genius of a great tutor lay in transforming this potential contradiction into a single, coherent sense of duty. The focus shifted from the privilege of power to its immense responsibility. The crown was not a prize to be enjoyed, but a burden to be borne with humility and service. Every lesson, every historical example, was framed around a central question. How does a king use his position, whether divinely ordained or constitutionally granted, to better the lives of his subjects? The weight of the crown was not its jewels, but the millions of souls whose fortunes rested upon the character of the man who wore it. This was the ultimate goal, to forge a sovereign who felt the solitude of his power not as a punishment, but as a sacred call to serve. A tutor's influence did not end when the prince closed his final textbook. It was woven into the very fabric of the king's mind, a quiet voice of reason that could echo for decades. Years after their formal lessons concluded, the tutor's guiding principles would resurface at the most critical moments. Faced with a cabinet in turmoil or a difficult parliamentary bill, the monarch might recall a specific historical parallel his tutor had once explained over a worn map. A philosophical argument about justice, debated in the schoolroom, could later inform a royal pardon or a new social policy. The tutor's greatest success was not in what the prince memorized, but in how he learned to think. They had installed the mental architecture through which every future crisis would be filtered. This was a form of intellectual inheritance as significant as any crown jewel. The tutor's personal relationship with his charge only deepened this bond. A prince often spent more waking hours with his tutor than with his own parents. This created a unique intimacy and trust, a bond that could withstand the sycophants and political pressures of the court. When the young king faced his first true test of leadership, he was not entirely alone. The ghost of his tutor's counsel stood with him, a foundation of calm wisdom in a storm of expectation. How many royal speeches contained the refined logic of a beloved teacher? How many diplomatic triumphs were rooted in lessons on empathy and negotiation, learned not from an ambassador, but from the man who taught him Greek? The tutor's legacy was a subtle but enduring fingerprint on history, a quiet force that helped steer the ship of state long after he had left the palace. The true power behind the throne was often not a minister or a general, but the memory of a teacher's voice, patiently shaping a king's soul for the weight it was destined to bear. The quiet of the schoolroom was about to be shattered by the echo of a radical idea. Consider the case of a tutor we will call Mr. Ashworth, a brilliant young academic hired to instruct a prince in the final years of the 19th century. Ashworth was a product of his time, deeply influenced by new currents of social thought sweeping across Europe. He did not merely teach history, he challenged his royal pupil to question its very foundations. In their private lessons, he introduced the prince to the writings of progressive philosophers and economists who dared to critique the vast inequalities of the industrial age. He spoke not of a king's divine right to rule, but of a government's social contract with its people. He presented arguments for workers' rights, for universal education, and for a more equitable distribution of wealth. To Ashworth, these were simply the most pressing ideas of the modern world, essential for any future leader to understand. But within the gilded cage of the court, such teachings were not education, they were sedition. The scandal broke not with a shout, but with a whisper. A forgotten notebook, left open on a desk, contained the prince's careful notes on these radical theories. A horrified governess discovered it and immediately took it to the boy's father, a staunch traditionalist. The court was thrown into an uproar. Conservative courtiers, whose power depended on the preservation of the status quo, were aghast. They saw Ashworth not as a teacher, but as a poisoner of the royal well, a dangerous radical planting the seeds of future abdication, or worse, revolution. The prince's mother, our ambitious American heiress, found herself in a tortuous position. Part of her admired the modern, forward-thinking nature of the lessons, yet she feared the political firestorm was jeopardizing her son's very claim to the throne. Her grand design was threatened not by a foreign army, but by a tutor's lesson plan. The confrontation was inevitable. Ashworth was summoned to the Duke's private study, a room filled with portraits of stern ancestors. The air was thick with accusation. The Duke did not merely dismiss him, he excoriated him. "How dare you fill my son's head with these vulgar, democratic notions?" he thundered. "You were hired to build a king, not a common politician." The tutor stood his ground, arguing that a modern monarch must understand the forces shaping his century. But in that moment, his fate was sealed. His radical ideas, however well-intentioned, were a threat too great to the established order. Mr. Ashworth was given a few hours to pack his belongings and was escorted from the palace, his career in ruin. The prince watched from a window, his view of the wider world abruptly narrowed, a lesson in the peril of thinking too far outside the palace walls. The palace gates closed behind Mr. Ashworth, but the real work of erasure was just beginning. The court machinery, so adept at pageantry, now shifted to a quieter, more insidious purpose: the complete purging of the tutor's ideological stain. Courtiers who had once politely nodded to the scholar now spoke of him only in hushed, disparaging tones, branding him a dangerous radical and an unfit influence. His name was systematically scrubbed from the prince's official schedule and educational records, as if he had never existed at all. The prince's new tutor was a carefully vetted traditionalist, a man whose every lesson was designed to systematically dismantle and rebut the progressive ideas Ashworth had planted. Each history lesson now emphasized the perils of revolution. Each economics lecture, the dangers of upsetting the natural social order. It was a deliberate, psychological counterinsurgency waged in the schoolroom. For the young prince, this created a profound and painful conflict. He had trusted Mr. Ashworth, had found his ideas challenging and exciting. Now, he was being told that his mentor was not just wrong, but a villain, and that the intellectual curiosity he had felt was a form of disloyalty to his own family and future throne. How does a child reconcile the warm, encouraging teacher he admired with the sinister figure described by his own father? This forced him into a terrible choice: to side with the memory of his trusted guide, or to accept the cold verdict of the court and the family he was born to lead. The lesson he learned was far darker than any political theory. It was that independent thought came at the cost of exile. A wall went up within the prince's mind, separating his private self from his public duty. He learned to keep his own counsel, to question silently, and to understand that his education was not about the pursuit of truth, but the preservation of power. The scandal did not just remove a tutor, it installed a permanent censor in the future king's own conscience. The palace walls, which seemed so thick, were in fact porous to the most dangerous kind of rumor. Another scandal rippled through the gilded corridors, one far more intimate than a debate over political theory. This one involved not the prince's mind, but his mother's heart. Whispers began to suggest that the ambitious American heiress and her son's handsome new tutor, a man we will call Mr. Daventry, shared more than just a common interest in the boy's education. The relationship, if it existed, was a complex web of power, loneliness, and a devastatingly convenient attraction. For the mother, trapped in a marriage of convenience to a distant, traditionalist duke, the tutor represented intellectual companionship and a refreshing break from the stifling formalities of court. He saw her not just as a duchess, but as a woman of wit and ambition. For Mr. Daventry, the attention from the lady of the house was intoxicating and perilously advantageous. Her favor could secure his position, influence his curriculum, and grant him an access to power he could never achieve on his own. Their private meetings, ostensibly to discuss the prince's progress, provided the perfect cover for a dangerous intimacy to bloom right under the nose of the court. Imagine the charged silence in the library after the prince was dismissed, the world narrowing to the two of them surrounded by the collected wisdom of centuries, all while ignoring the most basic rule of self-preservation. The risk was astronomical, yet for a lonely woman and an ambitious man, the temptation to cross that line must have felt like a rare and irresistible taste of freedom. But in a world where every glance was noted and every whispered conversation was analyzed, such a secret was a lit fuse waiting to reach its powder keg. The potential fallout was not merely a broken marriage, it was a dynastic cataclysm. If the rumors were proven true, the legitimacy of the prince himself could be thrown into question. Enemies of the family would not hesitate to suggest the heir was not the duke's son, but the tutor's. The very foundation of the succession, built on centuries of documented bloodlines, would be shattered by a single, salacious allegation. The American heiress's grand plan to see her son become king would be obliterated, not by a political rival, but by the shadow of a scandal that painted her as an adulteress and her child as a potential imposter. The crown, which demanded moral perfection from its women, would never survive such a stain. The tutor would be ruined, of course, but the true casualty would be the future of the monarchy they both claimed to serve. The entire elaborate structure of lineage and duty could crumble into dust, all because of a forbidden connection in a quiet library. The young prince's world fractured along a line he never knew existed. One day, his life was a predictable orbit around his mother's affection and his tutor's guidance. The next, he was the solitary prize in a silent, bitter war between them. His mother, the vibrant American who had always been his champion, was now a source of whispered shame and scandal. His tutor, the man who had unlocked the world of ideas for him, was painted as a treacherous villain who had exploited her loneliness. The boy was torn in two, his heart a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. To defend his mother felt like a betrayal of his father and the court's rigid code of honor. To condemn her felt like an unimaginable act of disloyalty to the person who loved him most. And Mr. Daventry, what was he? A trusted mentor or a cunning manipulator? The prince replayed every memory, every shared smile in the library, searching for a clue he had missed, the moment his innocent world had been poisoned. This personal drama became his most brutal lesson in statecraft, far more effective than any history book. He learned that love could be a weapon, that trust was a vulnerability, and that the people closest to you could hold the most dangerous secrets. The scandal taught him to build walls around his own heart, to question motives, and to see every relationship through the lens of potential risk. How could he ever form a genuine bond with a future advisor or even a wife, when his earliest model of such connections was tainted by betrayal and public humiliation? The prince learned to perform the role of a son and a student with a careful, measured distance, protecting the crown by isolating the boy who would one day wear it. His emotional landscape was forever scarred, not by the weight of the crown, but by the devastating human weakness of those who were meant to prepare him for it. The quiet whispers of the court were no match for the roar of the printing press. Across the Atlantic, a new power was rising, one that did not bow to titles or ancient lineage, the popular newspaper. For these new publications, a scandal involving a royal tutor and an American heiress was not a private tragedy. It was a perfect storm. It blended aristocracy, new money, illicit romance, and the corruption of a future king's education, a recipe for skyrocketing circulation. Editors in London and New York understood that their middle-class readers craved these glimpses behind the velvet curtain, a chance to see the mighty humbled. A single leaked detail from a disgruntled footman or a vengeful courtier could be inflated into a front-page sensation for weeks. The prince's classroom was no longer a private sanctuary. It was a public stage, and every misstep was now fodder for 1,000,000 breakfast tables. The pressure on the monarchy became immense and entirely new. Previously, a scandal could be contained within the palace walls, managed through quiet exile and stern denials. Now the court had to contend with an uncontrollable international echo chamber of newsprint. Reporters stalked the families involved, offering money for any shred of information. The American mother, raised in a culture with a freer press, suddenly faced a level of personal scrutiny she could never have anticipated. Her every public appearance was analyzed for signs of distress or defiance. The tutor, Mr. Daventry, found his name and likeness splashed across papers, transforming him from a scholar into a notorious public villain. This was not just about reporting the news. It was about creating a narrative of moral decay at the heart of the establishment. The monarchy, an institution built on mystique and distance, was being dragged into the harsh light of public opinion, its most intimate failures served up as entertainment. How could a future king command respect when his mother's alleged indiscretions were the subject of lurid speculation in every corner shop? The very foundation of royal authority, which relied on an image of impeccable morality, was being chipped away, not by rebels with guns, but by journalists with ink. The tutor stood squarely in the crossfire of a war he never signed up for. On one side stood the old European aristocracy, a world where education was a form of armor, designed to protect tradition and project unshakable authority. For them, the curriculum was a sacred text. The prince's role was to embody continuity, to become a living monument to his lineage. Discipline was rigid, focused on self-control and the suppression of personal feeling for the sake of public duty. A king, in this view, was born, not made. His education was merely the polishing of a divine right. Then there was the heiress mother, a force of New World ambition. She saw education as a tool for transformation and progress. For her, the schoolroom was a workshop for building a modern leader, one who could adapt, innovate, and command respect in a changing world. She valued critical thinking over rote memorization and charisma over stoic reserve. Her son was not just inheriting a throne, he was being prepared to reshape it. The tutor's every decision became a political statement. Choosing a history text became a choice between a volume on military conquests, favored by the father's circle, or a new treatise on economic theory, pushed by the mother. A lesson on rhetoric could spark a conflict should the prince learn the formal, ceremonial language of the court, or the more direct, persuasive style of a democratic politician. Even the prince's leisure reading was contested ground. Was a novel by a socially conscious author an enlightening glimpse into the lives of his future subjects, or a dangerous dose of radical sentiment? The tutor was constantly mediating, trying to satisfy two opposing visions of monarchy itself. He had to please a duke who believed a king should rule, and a duchess who believed he should lead. This was more than a disagreement over pedagogy. It was a battle for the soul of the future king, fought one lesson plan at a time. Every day, the tutor had to answer a silent, impossible question. Was his job to create a guardian of the past or an architect of the future? Sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a court was not a dagger, but a well-placed idea. Beyond the open conflict between parents and the scandal of illicit relationships lay an even more insidious threat: the tutor, who was not merely an educator, but a political agent. Rival factions within the court, or even foreign governments, understood that the schoolroom was the most effective place to shape the future. A carefully selected tutor could be the ultimate long game, a sleeper agent whose influence would only mature when his pupil took the throne. Imagine a minister who fears the current king's policies, but sees an opportunity in his young heir. He might maneuver his own candidate into the tutoring position, a man whose loyalty lies not with the crown, but with that minister's political faction. This tutor would then, over years of intimate contact, carefully steer the prince's sympathies. A lesson on trade could subtly favor one nation's interests over another. A discussion of history might consistently glorify one political philosophy while undermining its opponents. The prince, trusting his teacher completely, would absorb these biases as simple facts, never realizing he was being groomed to serve a hidden agenda. The tutor's true curriculum was allegiance, disguised as education. He would praise certain courtiers and dismiss others, shaping the prince's social and political landscape long before he had the power to rule it. This was a corruption of the most sacred trust, turning the guide for a future king into a puppet master's string. How could a young boy, isolated within palace walls, possibly discern that the man teaching him about honor and duty was himself acting in deceit? His entire worldview was being constructed on a foundation of someone else's design, all for a political payoff that might not come for decades. The most successful of these agents would never be discovered, their work complete when the prince, now king, made a decision that seemed entirely his own, yet perfectly aligned with his tutor's secret purpose. The moment the prince becomes king is the moment the schoolroom door closes forever. The delicate balance of their relationship shatters in an instant. The man who once corrected his grammar and guided his hand over a map must now bow his head and address his former pupil as Your Majesty. This transition is one of the most psychologically complex in any royal court. The tutor, who for years held all the authority, suddenly possesses none. His power was always borrowed, contingent on the boy's minority, and the coronation reclaims it all. The king, now vested with divine and constitutional authority, must project an image of sovereign command. How can he do that with the one man who remembers his childhood stumbles and his moments of intellectual uncertainty standing in the throne room? The ghost of the boy he was can be a threat to the monarch he needs to become. For the tutor, this is a deeply bittersweet culmination. He has succeeded in his ultimate goal to see his charge ascend the throne, yet in that success, he has made himself obsolete in his old role. His greatest triumph is also his professional exile from the intimate world they once shared. He may feel a profound pride, but it is inevitably mixed with a sense of loss. The question now is whether their bond can be reforged into something new, or if the weight of the crown demands a clean break from the past. Could the tutor step into the role of a trusted royal advisor? In some rare cases, yes. A king, surrounded by flatterers and political schemers, might desperately crave one voice he can trust implicitly. He might summon his old tutor to a private council, valuing the man's disinterested loyalty and deep understanding of his character. In these moments, the tutor's influence reaches its zenith. His lessons finally applied to the real world of statecraft, but this scenario is fraught with peril. Courtiers who have waited years for power will deeply resent the sudden influence of a mere scholar. They will whisper that the king is still clinging to his teacher's apron strings, that he lacks the confidence to rule without his childhood guide. The tutor's very presence can become a symbol of the king's inability to fully embrace his own authority. The wisest tutors often understood this dynamic best. They knew that their final and perhaps greatest lesson was to gracefully recede, to offer counsel only when asked, and to never, ever presume upon their past intimacy. They had to perform the ultimate act of service by making it seem as though the king had never needed them at all. The relationship's fate ultimately rested on the king's own security. A confident sovereign could cherish his tutor as a living link to his own humanity. An insecure one might see him as a walking reminder of a time when he was not in control, a chapter of his life that needed to be firmly closed. The pupil had become the master, and in doing so, he had to decide what to do with the man who taught him everything he knew. A king's reign is often a delayed echo of his education. The principles instilled by a forward-thinking tutor did not vanish with the man's dismissal from the palace. Instead, they often lay dormant in the monarch's mind, a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Years later, when faced with rising social unrest or an economic crisis, that king might recall a forgotten lesson on workers' rights or the theories of modern economists. The tutor's voice, once a source of scandal, could resurface as a quiet counsel of pragmatism and foresight. A monarch educated to understand the social contract, not just the divine right of kings, might approach reform not as a threat, but as a necessary evolution for his nation's survival. He would see his role not merely as a defender of tradition, but as a steward of his people's welfare, a subtle but profound shift in perspective planted decades earlier in the schoolroom. We can see this dynamic in historical parallels, where enlightened tutors left a clear mark on their royal pupils. Consider the reign of Frederick the Great of Prussia. His early education was steeped in French philosophy and the arts, much to the fury of his militaristic father. That foundation, laid by tutors who valued culture and reason over brute force, shaped a king who became a renowned patron of the arts and a reformer of the legal system, even as he was a brilliant military commander. The lessons of his youth created a ruler of fascinating contradiction and depth. In a more constitutional context, Queen Victoria's own early schooling under a liberal-minded governess, Baroness Lazen, helped foster a sense of personal morality and duty that defined her long reign. The influence was not always about grand political theory. Sometimes it was a simple lesson in empathy, a tutor ensuring his royal charge understood the lives of the poor and the suffering caused by industrial exploitation. That cultivated empathy could, years later, be the difference between a king who suppressed a protest with soldiers and one who sought to address its root causes with legislation. Yet this legacy was a double-edged sword. A monarch imbued with progressive ideals could find himself tragically out of step with his own government and the conservative forces of the court. His attempts at modernization, inspired by those youthful lessons, might be seen as weakness or naivete by hardline advisors. He could become a king trapped between two worlds, too reformist for the old guard and too traditional for the radicals. His reign characterized by frustration and stalled progress. The very ideas that made him a forward-thinking sovereign could also make him a politically isolated one. The tutor's greatest success could become his pupil's greatest political liability. How many kings, shaped by a vision of a more just society, spent their reigns battling the very institutions they were born to lead? The classroom's radical ideas, once set loose in the mind of a king, created a ripple effect that could either modernize a monarchy or expose its deepest contradictions. A rigid education could forge a monarch, as unyielding as the throne he inherited. While the progressive tutor sparked scandal, the deeply conservative instructor was often seen as a safe choice, a guardian of tradition. His curriculum was a fortress built against the modern world, its walls lined with military history, divine right doctrine, and the absolute necessity of royal authority. This was an education in command, not in compromise. The prince learned that a king's word was law, that his duty was to rule, not to negotiate. He studied the glorious conquests of his ancestors, but rarely the complex social treaties that held a modern nation together. The subtle arts of political persuasion were dismissed as the tools of scheming parliamentarians. His worldview was shaped by a single, unwavering principle: stability through strength. A king must be a rock in a turbulent sea, not a sail that adjusts to the changing winds. On the surface, this produced a sovereign of immense dignity and resolve. He could inspire his troops and uphold centuries of ceremony with flawless precision. But what happened when the world refused to conform to his lessons? The 20th century did not bow to divine right. It was a maelstrom of world wars, economic collapse, and roaring democratic demands. A king educated only to command found himself utterly bewildered by the need to listen. When faced with striking workers, he saw not a social grievance to be addressed, but a challenge to his authority to be suppressed. When his ministers advised compromise with an elected body, he perceived it as weakness, a betrayal of his sacred birthright. His entire mental framework, so carefully constructed by his tutor, had no room for the messy, collaborative reality of modern governance. He was an absolute monarch living in a constitutional age, a relic trying to steer a speeding locomotive. This profound disconnect could paralyze a reign. His refusal to adapt, to even acknowledge the legitimacy of new political forces, made him a symbol of the past, not a leader for the future. The monarchy, under such a king, risked becoming an irrelevant museum piece, its power draining away not in a dramatic revolution, but through a slow, steady erosion of public respect and political relevance. The conservative tutor, aiming to create a pillar of strength, had instead built a king who could not bend, and in his rigidity, threatened to break the very institution he was sworn to uphold. The most dangerous book in the palace was the one written after the tutor left. Once their service ended, many royal tutors faced a powerful temptation to write their memoirs. These were not ordinary autobiographies. They were explosive insider accounts, the key to the most private room in the kingdom. The public's appetite for these revelations was insatiable. After years of formal portraits and carefully managed press, here was a chance to see the royal family not as icons, but as human beings. Readers devoured every anecdote about the prince's childhood temper, his academic struggles, or his secret hobbies. They wanted to know what the king was really like before the crown hardened him. For the tutor, the motivation was complex. It was a chance to secure their own place in history, to set the record straight, or simply to earn a significant sum of money after a lifetime of service that, while prestigious, was not always highly paid. But the act of writing was a tightrope walk over a chasm of scandal. Every remembered conversation, every private observation was a potential betrayal. A memoir could be a gentle, affectionate portrait, but it could just as easily become a weapon. Imagine a tutor, perhaps still bitter over his dismissal, detailing the queen mother's interfering nature or the king's occasional intellectual laziness as a boy. He might subtly claim credit for the monarch's most popular policies, suggesting they were born from his own progressive lessons. Conversely, he might defensively shift blame for a king's disastrous decision, arguing that his wiser counsel was ignored by a stubborn and arrogant pupil. This created a final, lasting controversy that could haunt a reign from beyond the Tutor's grave. The monarchy, which relied on mystery and deference, now had to contend with a first-hand witness, reducing its sacred rituals to petty family squabbles and pedagogical failures. The king would have to sit on his throne, knowing that a book in every shop window contained his childhood's secrets, published by the very man he had once trusted most. How could a sovereign command absolute respect when his entire court had read about the time he cried over a failed mathematics test? The Tutor's memoir was the ultimate act of reclaiming power, a final lesson that taught the king a brutal truth. No one holds a grudge like the man who taught you everything you know. The ideal royal tutor was a psychological paradox, a fusion of traits that would tear a lesser person apart. He needed the intellectual fire of a great university don, capable of debating philosophy and dissecting military campaigns. Yet this brilliance had to be paired with the patience of a saint, for his pupil was not a graduate student, but a child, often a willful one. Personal ambition was an essential fuel, driving him to accept a role of immense stress and scrutiny. Yet that ambition had to be perfectly concealed. Any overt hunger for power or status would be instantly detected and punished by the wary court. He needed the political savvy of a seasoned diplomat to navigate the constant intrigue around him, understanding every alliance and rivalry without ever appearing to take a side. And above all, he required a level of discretion so profound it became a part of his very soul. He was a vault for the royal family's most intimate secrets, from a prince's learning difficulties to a queen's private anxieties. The pressure was relentless. Every lesson was a performance reviewed by a hostile committee of parents, courtiers, and future historians. A single misplaced word, one poorly received idea, could end his career and tarnish his legacy forever. This pressure cooker environment could breed a dangerous ego. After all, this man held the future of a dynasty in his hands. He was the architect of a king's mind. It was intoxicating to know that your thoughts might one day become state policy, that your voice might echo in the throne room decades later. The temptation to see the prince not as a person to be nurtured, but as a monument to be built in your own image, was a constant, insidious danger. Could such a man remain humble, or would he eventually succumb to the belief that he, and not the prince, was the true maker of kings? His greatest challenge was not teaching history, but mastering his own pride. The relationship between a tutor and his royal pupil is one of history's most enduring archetypes. Centuries before our Gilded Age drama, the ancient world witnessed a partnership that would become the ultimate model for all others. The philosopher Aristotle was summoned to the Macedonian court to tutor a young, tempestuous prince named Alexander. This was not a simple academic posting. It was a fusion of the greatest mind of the age with the raw, untamed energy of a future conqueror. For several years, Aristotle poured the entirety of Greek knowledge into his student. He taught him ethics, politics, medicine, and the principles of logical thought. He instilled in Alexander a profound appreciation for Greek culture and the Homeric ideals of heroism. The goal was to civilize the prince, to temper his ferocious ambition with wisdom and statecraft. In many ways, he succeeded brilliantly. Alexander's later respect for the cultures he conquered, his founding of great libraries and cities, all reflected the broad, enlightened world his tutor had provided. Yet, this story also reveals the fundamental limit of a tutor's power. Aristotle could provide the tools, but he could not control how his pupil would wield them. The same man who learned philosophy from Aristotle would also order the brutal burning of the palace at Persepolis. The same student who discussed ethics would later execute his own childhood friend in a fit of rage. Aristotle's lessons on governing diverse peoples were applied to create a vast empire, but the tutor's hope for a unified world of reason ultimately crumbled beneath the hooves of his student's warhorse. The relationship soured in later years, with Alexander coming to see his teacher's kin as potential traitors. The perfect fusion of mind and power had fractured, proving that even the most brilliant tutor could not fully dictate the character of the king he helped to create. This ancient pattern echoes through the centuries. The formidable Abbé Fénelon, tutor to Louis XIV's grandson, wrote a masterpiece of political instruction, The Adventures of Telemachus, specifically to guide his pupil toward a vision of enlightened, peaceful kingship. The book became a European sensation, but the prince died before he could ever become the ideal monarch Fénelon had dreamed of. A tragic reminder that the tutor's influence is always at the mercy of fate. These historical parallels show us that the dynamic we see in the Gilded Age palace is not new. The same core tensions exist across millennia: the struggle between the tutor's ideals and the pupil's inherent will, between the blueprint for a perfect king and the flawed, human prince who must somehow fit it. The echo of the royal tutor has never truly faded. It has simply changed its uniform. Today, the schoolroom has been replaced by the private office, and the classical scholar by a small, powerful cadre of modern advisors. These are the private secretaries, the directors of communications, and the trusted speechwriters who form the innermost circle around a contemporary prince or king. Their influence is arguably more immediate and more politically charged than that of any 19th century tutor. A private secretary today does not just manage a monarch's diary. He is the gatekeeper to the sovereign's ear, the first filter for every piece of state business, every potential scandal, and every request for a royal audience. He must possess a superhuman discretion, a deep understanding of constitutional law, and the political antennae of a seasoned prime minister. One misplaced word of advice, one poorly vetted guest list for a state banquet, can trigger an international incident. Then there is the speechwriter, the modern-day rhetorician. This individual holds the immense power to shape the royal voice, to find the precise language that can console a nation in mourning, unify a divided people, or define an entire reign. They translate the monarch's intentions into a script that will be dissected by millions. The choice of a single phrase over another can signal a subtle shift in policy, a nod to a new generation, or a quiet rebuke to a political faction. These advisors are the unseen architects of the royal image, operating in a world of 24-hour news cycles and social media firestorms. Their curriculum is not history or philosophy, but public opinion, media strategy, and global diplomacy. They teach their royal charges not about the divine right of kings, but about the court of public perception. The fundamental dynamic, however, remains unchanged. It is still a relationship of immense trust and intimacy, where a non-royal individual is granted unparalleled access to shape the thoughts, words, and ultimately, the legacy of a monarch. The modern confidant, like the tutor of old, walks the same tightrope between guidance and overreach, between serving the crown and inadvertently becoming a power behind it. In an age of transparency, their success is measured by their ability to remain utterly invisible, their profound influence hidden in plain sight. History is often told as the story of kings, of their battles and decrees. But what if the blueprint for those decisions was drafted by a quiet scholar in a sunlit schoolroom? These royal tutors are the unseen architects of our past, their private lessons etched into the laws, the alliances, and the very character of nations. For every monarch who led with wisdom or stumbled into folly, the ghost of their tutor's voice was often whispering in their ear. This is the hidden human drama of power, the intimate story of how one individual's philosophy could be quietly translated into the governance of millions. To truly understand why a king chose peace over war, or reform over repression, we must look past the throne and into the classroom where his conscience was first formed. These educators wielded a unique form of influence, one that bypassed the noisy councils of state and spoke directly to the soul of the future ruler. Their legacy is not recorded in official proclamations, but in the subtle patterns of a reign, the consistent choices that reveal a mind shaped by a particular set of ideals. Was a king's noted compassion a reflection of his tutor's emphasis on empathy? Was his stubborn resistance to change the product of a strictly traditionalist education? The answers lie with these forgotten figures. They remind us that history is not an inevitable force, but a tapestry woven from countless personal choices. And few choices were more consequential than selecting the teacher for a boy who would one day wear a crown. By pulling back the curtain on these powerful instructors, we see monarchy not as a remote institution, but as a profoundly human endeavor, where the fate of empires could hinge on the relationship between a patient man and his princely pupil. The royal tutor's power was a quiet, subterranean force, flowing beneath the thrones and scepters to shape the very bedrock of a reign. This was a figure eternally suspended between worlds, navigating the treacherous waters where a mother's dynastic dreams met the cold realities of statecraft, where the pure pursuit of knowledge collided with the murky art of political survival. Their true curriculum was the human soul of a future king, a responsibility more profound than any prime minister's portfolio. They were the architects of conscience, the engineers of judgment, and the silent partners in every major decision a monarch would ever make. So the next time you study the portrait of a king or read about the pivotal choices of his reign, look past the crown. Ask not only what he did, but who taught him. The answer might reveal the hidden hand that guided an empire. We would love to hear from you which of these royal tutor scandals, from the radical ideas of a Mr. Ashworth to the dangerous intimacy of a Mr. Daventry, do you find the most compelling? Share your thoughts in the comments below.